Good afternoon. Today we shall be forming a basic idea of what Renaissance humanism is and how it influenced English literature. Now, when we speak of the word humanism, among the various definitions that have come down to us, the commonality of all such definitions and concepts reflect that humanism reflects a concern with the legacy of antiquity, and in particular, but not exclusively, with its literary legacy, which characterizes the works of scholars from at least the ninth century onwards. It involves, above all, the rediscovery and study of ancient Greek and Roman texts, the restoration and interpretation of them, and the assimilation of the ideas and values that they contain. It ranges from an archaeological interest in the remains of the past to a highly focused philological attention to the details of all manner of written records, from inscription to epic poems, but comes to pervade, as we shall see in our discussion today, almost all areas of post medieval culture, including theology, philosophy, political thought, ideas of jurisprudence, medicine, mathematics, and the creative arts. Grounded in what we would now think of it as learned research, it rapidly found expression in teaching as well, and in this way, it was to become the embodiment of and the vehicle for that very classical tradition that is the most fundamental aspect of the continuity of European culture and intellectual history. This discussion will also attempt to trace the main features of that continuity from its apparent beginnings in the ninth century to the end of the 14th century, a period in which scholarly interest was focused significantly but by no means exclusively on Roman culture and Latin literature. Although humanism took root in the learned literature and culture of the 15th century England, it was not until the next century that it bore fruit in vernacular literature. In the period between the Florentine humanist Bracciolini's visit to England, which happened sometime between 1418 to 1422, and Bishop William Waynflett's founding of Magdalen College at Oxford, which happened around 1480, English book collectors, diplomats, and grammarians increased their knowledge of Latin classical learning. These cultural links with Italy fostered the creation of the humanistic libraries and grammar schools which would educate the Tudor elite. Among them, the first great humanist writer, Sir Thomas More, who, unlike many of his contemporaries, had no direct contact with Italy. As in Italy, humanism took root in England at a time when the education it promoted was suited to the needs of the governing classes, the monarch, members of the council, church officials, and the civil servants. First, it is necessary to give a very brief account of the 15th century developments which led to the growth of a close relationship between humanism and literature in the 16th century England. The contrast between English learning of the 15th and 16th centuries can be gauged by comparing the responses of two continental humanists who traveled to England at that point in time. Arriving around 1418, Poggio complained in a letter to his friend Niccolo Niccoli that his search for classical texts in England had proved fruitless, and he said, "Better give up hope of books from England, for they care little for them here." Unquote. Yet, when Erasmus visited England for the first time in 1499, he came away with praise for the native humanists William Gossin, Thomas Linacre, and Thomas More. He said, and I quote, "It's marvelous to see what an extensive and rich crop of ancient learning is springing up here in England." Unquote. Although Poggio may have been somewhat unlucky in his choice of manuscript collections to search, still there is a tale to be told between the two historical moments. What happened in 15th century English intellectual life to account for these opposing views of England as cultural desert in an earlier visit and a fertile soil in a later visit is something that interests scholars of Renaissance humanism in England. The works of three 15th and early 16th century authors, namely Sir Thomas Malory, John Lydgate, and John Skelton, serve to illustrate how little influence humanism had on the literature of this period. First edited and published by William Caxton in 1485, Malory's More to the Author is medieval not only in subject matter but also in style, which derived from its sources in the French prose, Arthurian cycle, and English alliterative poetry of an earlier generation. Unlike the Romance epics of Italian authors educated in the humanist tradition, such as Matteo Maria Boiardo's Orlando Innamorato, books 1 and 2, which was published in 1483, and book 3, which was published in 1495, and Lodovico Ariosto's Orlando Furioso, which was published in 1516, Malory's works lacks the ironic play between allusions to classical and medieval texts. Lydgate's work, Fall of Princes, which was written sometime in 1431, which translates and expands Laurent de Premier Faith's French version of Boccaccio's The Fall of Illustrious Men, seems closer to Italian humanism. The tragedies of Cato and Scipio, for example, stress their Roman virtues. Lydgate's poetic narratives, however, are thoroughly medieval, unlike, or rather like, those of Laurent and Boccaccio, and to a large extent those of The Mirror for Magistrates, a work published in 1559, which was originally intended as a continuation of The Fall of Princes. For Lydgate, the decline from happiness to misery is ultimately seen as a fall from grace and is explained in terms of a moral lesson. Some 16th century tragedies, for example, especially the tragedies of the earliest ones, are also of this type, which imply the great tragedies of Marlowe and Shakespeare. However, they share with the classical antecedents a tragic fall that is impelled by heroic greatness, which, because it is mysteriously mixed with human weakness and evil, is not easily moralized. It was visits to and from Italy, donations of classical texts to university libraries, humanistic instruction in Latin and Greek, and above all, the establishment of a new curriculum in the schools, which contributed significantly to the development of 15th century humanist culture in England and paved the way for the emergence of 16th century humanist literature. In England, one of the first Italian humanists after Poggio to visit England was the papal collector Pietro del Monte. Unlike many other Italians and Englishmen who traveled between the two countries, Del Monte's journey was made possible by his official church position. Much of the cultural interaction at that point in time between Italy and England essentially took the form of embassies to and from Rome. Many translations and imitations, however, rose above mere following to create a new meter and verse forms which would be taken up by later generation of English poets. Among them, the most influential of these were the translation of Petrarch's lyric poems by Sir Thomas Watt and the English version of Virgil's Aeneid by Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey. The poetry of Watt and Surrey forms a major part of the inward-looking phase of English humanism, which, unlike the international humanism of Thomas More, who wrote in Latin for a learned European audience, concerned itself with translating classical and Italian Renaissance culture into the vernacular. Although Watt and Surrey originally wrote for the aristocratic readers, after their deaths, their works were widely disseminated in the much popular Tottel's Miscellany, which was first published in 1557, with 9 further editions during the reign of Queen Elizabeth. The preface of this collection exhorts, to quote, the unlearned by reading to learn, to be more skillful, and to purge that swine-like grossness, unquote, anticipating the complaint of Ascam, who wanted English verse to adopt the quantitative meters and metrics of classical poetry, that to follow rather the Goths in rhyming than the Greeks in true versifying, were even to eat acorns with swine, when we may freely eat wheat bread amongst men, unquote. In his versions of books 2 and 4 of Aeneid, also published by Tottel in 1557, Surrey departed from the paths followed by previous translators, eschewing both the rhymed couplets and the colloquial language of the Scots poet Gavin Douglas and the quantitative English verse based on the Latin model of the Dublin poet Richard Stanihurst. Instead, he developed the unrhymed iambic pentameter of blank verse for Virgil's dactylic hexameter and found an English equivalent for the complexity and restrained sublimity of Virgil's Latin syntax and diction. He can therefore be credited with achieving what can be said to be a humanistic ideal and with creating a poetic form that would influence the dramatic verse of Marlowe and Shakespeare. Now, the increasing prominence of humanism in the cultural life of the English nation had an effect not only on the theory and practice of English poetry, but also importantly on English prose writing. In the vernacular version of Moore's Richard III, it is possible to discern the impact of classical authors on his prose style. Moore's finest and most important works, however, were composed not in English but in Latin. The first English humanist to display a wholehearted commitment, as it were, to writing in the vernacular English was Sir Thomas Eliot, compiler of the first Latin to English dictionary, which was published in 1538, to be based on humanistic principles and an accomplished scholar in both classical languages. He believed in the importance of making ancient learning available for the benefit of his fellow countrymen. Having translated Isocrates and Plutarch with the aim of seeing what he said, our English tongue might receive the quick, proper sentences pronounced by the Greeks, unquote, he came to the conclusion that it was appropriate to use the vernacular for the transmission of classical erudition. The Castle of Heath, published in 1534, is a book of remedies which he wrote in English in order to challenge the medical profession of his day, whose chief motive for using Latin, he believed, was to guard the secrets of their trade. In the third edition of this very popular work, Eliot responded to the outcry he had provoked by telling, and I quote, "If physicians be angry that I have written physic in English, let them remember that the Greeks wrote in Greek and the Romans in Latin, which were their own proper material tongue." It is apparent, therefore, that though Renaissance humanism in English literature was essentially a foreign affair in terms of their influence, later 16th century English literature grew out of the shadow of the Latin and Greek humanistic spirit and evolved a distinct Englishness, as it were, which was significantly reflected in the works of Shakespeare, Marlowe, and the other Elizabethan poets. Thank you.